All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Kimberly Mack, Elena Razgulova, Gus Stadler, Alex Vizi, and Eric Weisbard. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal tab. You can also check up on videos on all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including our March 4th discussion about K-pop fandom. Our next event is April 1st on Clublands with Maren Hancock and Charity Marsh with their book in progress on Canadian DJ culture and Al Shipley on Baltimore club music. So please join us then. But today we're excited to talk about place in another sense, the place of jazz in America, both culturally and physically, with two books from late last year, Andrew Berish's Hating Jazz, A History of Its Disparagement, Mockery, and Other Forms of Abuse from University of Chicago Press, and John Gennari's The Jazz Barn, Music in the Berkshires and the Place of Jazz in American Life from Brandeis University Press. And jazz historian Benjamin Cawthra also joins us to moderate the conversation. So before we start, let me tell you a little more about today's presenters. Andrew Berish is an associate professor in the Humanities and Cultural Studies Department at the University of South Florida at Tampa. Before Hating Jazz, he wrote 2012's Lonesome Roads and Street of Dreams, Place, Mobility, and Race in Jazz of the 1930s and 40s. And he's also published work on Barbara Streisand, Vaughn Monroe, Django Reinhardt, and Duke Ellington. John Gennari is a professor of English and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of Vermont. His 2017 book, Flavor and Soul, Italian America at its African American Edge, is a study of Black and Italian cultural intersections in music, food, sports, and other forms of expressive culture. And his first book, 2006's Blowin' Hot and Cool, Jazz and Its Critics, won the ESCAP Deems Taylor Award for Excellence in Music Criticism and the John G. Coelty Award for Best Book in American Cultural Studies. John is currently working on two projects, Black Italian, a documentary film based on the themes explored in Flavor and Soul, and The Kitchen Sessions, a collection of music and food-themed poems. And Benjamin Cawthra is professor of history at California State University, Fullerton. He is also the associate director of the Lawrence DeGraff Center for Oral and Public History, where he hosts the Outspoken podcast. His 2011 book, Blue Notes in Black and White, Photography and Jazz, examines the evolving representation of jazz subjects from the swing era of the 1930s to the Black nationalist 1960s. He's published jazz-related essays in a variety of venues and curated exhibitions on Miles Davis and on photographers Herb Snitzer, Kathy Sloan, and William Gottlieb. His current book project is The Redemptive Lens, Envisioning World War II era Italy for the University of Illinois Press. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. In the Q&A at the end of the session, Eric will call on you to unmute and ask them live. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation. To avoid any confusion, we'll ask the presenters to please ignore the chat during their discussion. We'll send them a copy of the transcript later so they won't miss anything. And that's everything you need to know. So please, Ben, take it away.
Thanks so much. Great to be here and great to be with you, John and Andrew. I know your work and have admired it from afar, but I've never had the chance to meet you. So it's great to see you there and to meet the two of you today in this forum with so many interested listeners is really a treat. So thanks for being here. I wanted to give both of you a chance for a few minutes to just talk about in broad strokes your book, what you're arguing. And I'll just say to those listening, these are amazingly accessible books. I mean, Andrew succeeded in getting me to like a book about hating something I love. How did you do that, Andrew? We need to talk about that today. And John's book is really a Valentine to a place that he loves and grew up at, and also a complex examination of that place with really broad implications and both really enjoyable reads. So Andrew, maybe you could start off with hating jazz. We need to get this out of the way right off the bat. So, Andrew, tell us about hating jazz, even though we may not want to hear about it.
It's funny, I've gotten that reaction quite a lot. I thought the title, well, initially it was just going to be Hating Jazz. I thought it was bold, but then the press is like, you can't do that. I was like, you need to qualify it that it's a history, that it's a study, that it's not not advocating for it. Um, well, thanks. It's nice to meet you. Sometime later, I'll tell you that I met Herb Snitzer once here in Tampa. He lived here in St. Petersburg, at a NAACP event, and we had a really interesting conversation, which I'll tell you about sometime. He's a character. But thanks. The project started. It started as a kind of conference paper, but I think it was triggered in part by the film La La Land when it came out in 2016. I know it was kind of a very polarizing film for everyone, but there's the famous scene where Seb is Ryan Gosling's a struggling jazz pianist, and he's this emerging love affair with Emma Stone, and they're walking, and Mia says, I hate jazz. You need to know this before we go any further. And then that leads to this like impassioned monologue by him, and he drags her to a mysterious jazz club in the middle of the day in Los Angeles. Maybe it exists. I don't know. And that became a very kind of the crux of a lot of the argumentation around the film, particularly in the jazz world, but I think beyond that too. And what was interesting is her use of hate. I hate jazz. And when I started kind of thinking about it, and you sort of try to take it apart, you're like, well, that's not hate in, Nazi hate or racism or misogyny. I mean, it's something else, right? And the more I sort of thought about it, I was like, I think there's a book here, a kind of reception history kind of flipped on its head a little, because hate is, we use it both as the marker of the kind of strongest emotions we have, and that often lead to violence and terrible things. But we also hate, chocolate chip ice cream and sweaters. So it seems strange that word can carry so much weight. So I thought, well, taking this, I'm a jazz scholar by training, and I've always been interested in the intersection of taste and evaluation, and kind of put the two together. And that led me to down another path where I was thinking more about emotion in music. And I think a kind of the third leg here of this project was the idea of emotion in music. And I adopted the word affect as a kind of broader word because emotion tends to be kind of individual and psychological, at least in the common sense way. And affect, the literature on affect is broad and complex, but it tends to emphasize sociality of feeling, that it's shared. And so this gave me the kind of framework for the book. And then rather than argue chronologically, I decided to do thematically, and talk about, so hate is variable. It comes in different forms. One form is taste evaluations. And this is, I hate Pat Boone. I mean, maybe you hate Pat Boone because he's a terrible person. But mostly I just don't like what he did when he covered those, Little Richard tunes or something like that. Then there's a kind of hate in the domain of humor and satire. The more I was getting into the book, the more that seemed the dominant, actually, way most Americans were engaging with jazz, broadly understood. And the final was hate in the form of contempt, where you just don't have respect for something. And this is the closest to hating in the strongest sense. The book, I'll just briefly say that these themes are united by one kind of overarching argument that jazz hate is variable, but it's always social. So, and I thought it was important to emphasize that music is the starting point for it. I don't like this melody or I don't like this rhythm, but that's never enough because that's never where taste ends. It's always a social judgment. And this is rooted in the work of Carl and before that, Bourdieu and all sorts of other people who have already tackled a lot of this stuff. The second argument is that jazz hate is what I called an effective practice, or I borrowed that term, which means like it's an ongoing engagement with the music that combines feeling and knowledge, that there's always a feeling component to our judgments. And I think a lot of work on taste and evaluation tends to, partly because it's hard, is bracket off emotional reactions. And finally, jazz hate, or these variations that I identify, is very often, well, it's always partakes of race in some sense, racial ideology, racial thinking. And most often it is through blackness and whiteness, through that particular formation, that particular racial formation. And the book really focuses on public expression. So like I can't read what's in people's minds, but I can read what they've spoken or said or committed to media in some form. And so that's what I did, and that the book is broken down into these three sections. If anyone's curious, I deal with Adorno in the introduction because he's probably the most famous alleged jazz hater. I have my thoughts if you're curious about that. That's sure to generate argument. And then the book closes with a consideration of ethics, because I have a colleague at USF, historian Brian Connolly, and he and Laura Cohen wrote this kind of smart and clever little piece for the LA Review of Books a while ago called it was like on hating or something. And it was basically hating as a kind of positive social ethic, a way of uniting people to kind of fight things that are wrong with the world, right? And we talked about that, and I found it really interesting. And so I the last chapter kind of deals with the ethics. Is it ever okay to hate music? And like, assuming we can define what that is. I come down on no, because I think it's kind of a bit of a slippery slope argument, but I think things tend to go south really quickly for reasons I can talk about later. Um, yeah, that's it. So that's a kind of summary of the argument and a breakdown of the book and kind of the origins.
That's great. I was kind of disappointed though, because when you started out writing about La La Land, I thought, finally somebody's going to tell me what jazz did to Damien Chazelle,
Oh,
because
yeah.
because everybody tells me I should love Whiplash and I should love La La Land, and I felt awful watching those films. And so it's not on you to solve the puzzle of Damien Chazelle, but I really appreciate this framework of this sociology of feeling or affect. And it is, I think, a bridge to John's work, because John talks about the creation of a community, a kind of sociology of feeling, as you say, around music, around a particular place. So, John, maybe you could tell us more about this place. I know you could go on for hours because you grew up there, but tell us about the book and how you expressed that place in your writing of this book.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to the organizers and to everybody on the call. So I grew up in this small town in western Massachusetts, Lenox, Massachusetts, best known as being the location of Tanglewood, the summer home of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and the Berkshire Music Center, a kind of summer conservatory in the area. Has similarly prestigious performing arts institutions in dance, Jacob's Pillow, various theater festivals, Williamstown Theater Festival, Berkshire Theater Festival, and others. And it's the Berkshires is pretty well known as particularly in the summer season, as a place of cultural tourism, allied with, the beauty of the place, the landscape, the mountains, the meadows, the lakes, etc. And so I was born in 1960. I went to Music Inn when it was programming rock music and blues and reggae in the 70s. I saw Bob Marley at at Music Inn, one of his very last concerts. The first time I got high, um, it was a contact high. My mother was quite dubious about the concept, but the band, the Kinks, Bruce Springsteen before he really blew up. In the '60s, it had programmed folk music, um, Dylan, uh, Joan Baez, etc. And I had heard stories about what went on there in the '50s. Music Inn is the name of the place, and it opened in 1950. It's a kind of carve out of an old estate property. The outbuildings, the greenhouse, the barn, the ice house, et cetera, connected to a place called Wheatley, which later became a grand hotel and very upscale restaurant. So the physical location, the Berkshires, elevated kind of place in the national narrative in terms of literature. This is very close to where Moby Dick was written, and Tanglewood actually takes its name from the Tanglewood Tales, Hawthorne's collection of short stories. Edith Wharton builds an estate, the Mount, in town, where she does most of her writing about interior decorating and lives of the well-to-do. And how does jazz fit into this scene, both in terms of where it is on the cultural hierarchy, and mostly in terms of race, and the predominant, almost exclusive, whiteness of the area, although the whiteness is complicated in important ways by ethnic difference. There's, of course, an indigenous population, um, uh, and there's a Jewish population that is kind of multi-class. There's a community of Jewish farmers, chicken farmers in particular. Um, Jazz in this place is, kind of an unusual thing. Now, jazz is everywhere, right? I used to explain to my younger students, give examples of what an oxymoron looks like, and I'd say Utah jazz. Um, well, it turns out there's great jazz in Utah, and there has been for a long time. Um, Mobility and place are so important to understanding the sweep of jazz, as a cultural phenomenon. Um, Andrew's earlier book on place and mobility is really very, very foundational to how I came to think about the framework for this book. And Benjamin, your work on photography was also really foundational because I'm able to include almost 80 photographs in this book that are really interesting. Most of them not taken by the famous jazz photographers, although there were famous jazz photographers there. But the um, um, lion's share of the ones I use were taken by a man named Clemens Kalischer, who was a German Jewish refugee, Holocaust survivor who ends up in the Berkshires and just happens on the scene. And he senses that there's something important here, but he doesn't know much about jazz. He doesn't know Dave Brubeck from uh, Duke Ellington or any other of the famous people who passed through here. And so he shoots the scene, and the sociality of the place becomes a place that programs workshops called jazz roundtables, where I argue that this is really the origin of what we have come to call jazz studies, a kind of interdisciplinary approach to the study of jazz and its cultural meaning. Later, it develops a concert series in this place called the Music Barn that is really the first jazz and folk series, I should say, and it's really the first thing of its kind. The Newport Jazz Festival starts in 1954 to much ballyhoo. The Newport Festival is just one weekend in the middle of the summer. Music In, from the mid 50s onward, is to the end of the 50s, is programming mostly jazz, but also folk music, 10 weeks in the summer, 2 or 3 concerts a week. And then it develops a school called the School of Jazz, starting in 1957, running to 1960, whose faculty is led by John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet. It includes the other members of the MJQ as faculty members, along with notables like Dizzy Gillespie and Max Roach and Kenny Durham and Bill Evans. And I mean, it's just a who's who. And it's really the first thing of its kind, and it attracts a lot of national attention because of that, as the concerts did. And so here's this place that you would find mention of, in a glancing way in jazz historiography. And then there was a short book called the Lenox School of Jazz, written by a man named Jeremy Yudkin, who teaches music at Boston University and also lives in the Berkshires. But I thought it needed a bigger platform, and I thought my American Studies approach would be helpful in framing the place as an important part of jazz's kind of place in the American story, both in the ways that what happens there connects with the literary cultural history of the area and gets kind of added to it, but also because of the ways it's so different from everything else that's sort of synonymous with the area. But it was really triggered by the photographs. I had written a bit about this in Blowin' Hot and Cool, and included just one photograph in that book, and that was a Kalischer photograph of John Lee Hooker at one of the jazz roundtables. He's seated in front of a blackboard that Marshall Stearns, who ran the roundtables, later started the Institute of Jazz Studies, and Stearns has put up a kind of genealogy of various streams of American folk music that lead into what he calls the mainstream, by which he meant the jazz mainstream. And the spine of the thing is the blues, and that's why John Lee Hooker happens to be there. And it's just, if anybody's seen it, it's gotten some circulation in recent years. It's a stunning photograph, both for its content, but also I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful photograph that captures the moment in a really, really deep way. And so I should probably leave it there to stay on schedule. But that's the origin of it and the way it connects with other work.
So glad you published all those photographs, John. They're really beautiful. Reason alone to get this book. But there are others. I wanted to ask both of you, before maybe we get into the nuts and bolts of the arguments and the evidence, it struck me reading both of these that these are very personal projects, maybe in slightly different ways. Andrew, when I was reading yours, I thought, I wonder if this is Andrew's attempt to understand why he loves jazz by understanding why it's hated, or some formulation of that, to better understand what it is you find attractive about it. And John, I was thinking about your own personal biography as well, and the way you grew up in this place, and that some assumptions about the place can't be made about you or your background. But I think for readers, it's another layer of interest, but also leads us to some of the most important things you have to say in these books. So Andrew, would you like to talk a little bit about that? What is the personal part of this book for you?
Yeah, uh, I was gonna show. I have a report card from elementary school, and it says, and Andy's doing great. He does not take criticism well, you know. So issues of judgment and evaluation. It's a personal thing. And mostly, this comes from learning to play jazz as a drummer and got introduced in high school and then later. And when you enter that world, it's exciting. You're trying to learn the music and trying to understand it. And you quickly learn that everyone's got kind of a different opinion. And it's interesting how in the jazz education world, there is a kind of other people have written about this, Ken Prouty and David Icke, but things have coalesced around certain ideas of how the music should function. But that kind of belies how much disagreement there still is. And it's very easy to find this online, different teachers. If you've ever heard pianist Fred Hirsch talk, he's incredibly interesting speaker, but he's really judgmental about who he likes and who he doesn't. And so growing up learning to play, I was like, how am I doing? And obviously you have a teacher, and so that teacher, you're working kind of to please that teacher or learn what that teacher has to say. But so it was this kind of very personal thing. And you sort of struggle like, am I getting better? And this person says I sound good, and this person says I don't. But it became bigger than that because I was always fascinated by like for classical music, I went to graduate school for musicology, but I wasn't a music major. And so my musical knowledge was kind of picked up here and there. And I found myself relying on books like Penguin guides and various jazz guides and record guides and things like that. And just sort of reflecting on and then listening to things and saying, oh, I like this now. Well, where did that come from? Do I like it because they told me I like it? And then it's like turtles all the way down. Then the floor falls out from under you, and you're like, wait a minute, what's holding all this up? And I have to say, I've come to terms with all this. I'm in a much better place. But that's the kind of personal dimension as that I think I've just always been interested in, like what shapes my responses and trying to understand that, and not to say that my experiences aren't genuine, but that was kind of the animating, the spark that kind of this whole thing, seed that this whole thing grew out of.
One thing you talk about in the book is the self-criticism within jazz and how actually cutting that can be and how defining that can be. People sort of, talk about the blindfold tests and the ways that people have been willing to criticize members of the jazz community on musical grounds, and some of it to be quite harsh. There does seem to be that element of it. Thanks for that. John, what do you think? Growing up in Lenox, how do you connect to this story?
So I grew up in a Italian working class family. My father grew up on a farm in the north of Italy. My mother was second generation, more conventional Italian American story. Her parents were the immigrants, the Ellis Island immigrants, and she grew up just over the George Washington Bridge in Bergen County, New Jersey. Married my father in the 1950s. Moved up to the Berkshires. We moved to Lenox in '63 when I was 3 years old. It was a town that if you went to the public high school, Lenox Memorial High School, almost by definition you were working class or lower middle class, because Lenox at the time I was there had no less than 7 private boarding schools that were located in the old estate properties, whose owners had sold out during the Depression. And so I grew up with a very strong sense of class because of that, because um, I was able to occupy both spaces in different ways. Meaning the summer camps and performing arts institutions where you can get jobs parking cars or serving food or whatever. I mean, you're in a kind of servant class situation, but in some ways that's a more interesting angle to have on the situation. And that was the angle, for instance, that Randy Weston, the great pianist composer, had when he first came to Lenox in 1950. He was working as a cook in at a place called Windsor Mountain, that was one of these private schools. Has a really interesting backstory that's related to um, um, Germany in the 1930s and the Jewish diaspora, and it's within um, walking distance to this place, Music Inn. But you have to go through woods to get there. And the story I tell in the first full chapter, I think most of you probably have only read if you've read the thing that was posted, it was the preface and introduction. But the first main chapter starts with this story of Randy um, being asked it's the summertime, and so school's not in session, but the camp is being used as a kind of summer camp for um, Jewish refugees, some of whom still have their camp numbers on their arms, and many of them are musicians. And um, Randy Weston has come up to the Berkshires from Brooklyn, in part, as he tells the story, to escape the drug scourge in the city during that time. Um, and he's gotten a series of jobs working in these estate properties, which he really likes because he finds there are great pianos in these spaces. And so he's been noodling on the piano in the front room at Windsor Mountain, got the attention of some of these Jewish women who were musicians, and they put on a concert. He had studied classical music, and he expected that's what they wanted him to play. And they said, no, 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 play what you've been playing. And these were bebop tunes, essentially, that he had learned as a high school student when he was classmates in Brooklyn Boys High School, or schoolmates with people like Max Roach and Cecil Payne and others who end up coming up to Lenox later as well. Um, so the women, find out about this place called Music Inn, and they say, Randy, there's this place very close to Tanglewood, we hear, where there's jazz. Let's go. They're hoping they can get a ride there with one of the locals, but that doesn't work out. They literally walk through the woods a couple of miles. A 6'7" black man from Brooklyn and these two kind of diminutive, one is Hungarian, I think, and one is Czech, Jewish women. They find their way to Music Inn, where Marshall Stearns is giving a lecture. And Stearns' big thing during this period is the framing of jazz as an Afro-diasporic music. He's the person who really alone among the major jazz intellectuals of the time is really focused on Africa, the Afro-Caribbean, and the kind of cultural continuity and connection that leads to blues and jazz. And Randy Weston is really drawn to this. He's grown up in a Caribbean family in Brooklyn with a very strong kind of Afrocentric ethos, and this is a very attractive, kind of way for him to think about this music. Um, the owners of Music Inn, who I haven't talked about yet, but they're a really important part of this story, Stephanie and Philip Barber, hire Weston as a breakfast cook. They hire him away from this other place, Windsor Mountain, which incidentally later becomes the school that Thelonious Monk, Randy Weston, Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, and others send their children to school. So I'm growing up in this town with that kind of private school, and a school with up to 15% African American, an up to 15% African American student body, in a town that most of us think of as having no black people whatsoever. So that part of the story interests me. But so Randy Weston goes on to become Randy Weston by spending every summer in the 50s at Music Inn. He's not a he's not a faculty member of the School of Jazz, but the work that he does there, he starts touring the country with Marshall Stearns, who's a little weak in his understanding of modern jazz. And so Randy Weston he puts a trio together, and Randy becomes the demonstration part of the lecture demonstration that Stearns is doing at colleges around the country. But Randy's really interested in the African, the early part of the African decolonization movement as it's connected to the civil rights movement. He ends up going to Africa, as many of you know, and the first recordings that he makes there are inspired by Africa, Uruhu Africa, for instance. It's all Music Inn personnel, including Langston Hughes, who's doing who's kind of written a text, to go with the music. So there's this amazing confluence of all these different things going on: post World War II cultural tourism, artistic modernism, the Afro-Caribbean diaspora, and here's John Gennari decades later figuring out that this the full dimensions of the story I don't think really have been documented, and so I go for it.
I love that. And, it reminds me of this period of the 1950s. As we think about jazz history, we think of it, and as we think of American history, is one of consensus, right? It's often described as the period of consensus, Cold War consensus, integrationist phase of the civil rights movement, a kind of acceptance among the middle class of jazz. Andrew, you write about this in your book as well. Maybe both of you could talk about why is jazz positioned quite the way it is in this post-war moment in the 50s? John Lennon said, he was interviewed, said, "Oh, we hated jazz. We hated jazz. That was for posh boys," or something, right? So that's like there's this moment where all of a sudden it's not it anymore, but it was for a time. So maybe the two of you could talk about this time when seemingly there's an acceptance of jazz, when earlier parental generations have hated it because they're not sure what their kids are up to, but now we're in a new post-war world. So Andrew, maybe you could start on that.
Sure. Yeah, I frame it. Yeah, this is good because I think John can speak to. I mean, I'm sort of focused on the imagery, the kind of representations of it, and John was sort of excavating actually how it was really functioning at the time. But I kind of trace in the taste chapter, I kind of revisit swing in the 30s and 40s and then move into the 50s, because what I thought it was interesting to tell that kind of view the history of swing and then what jazz becomes post World War II through this lens of this perception of the music as having this kind of a particular affect, and it was very closely tied to race, and it's just evident in everything people write. So in the 30s, it was there were concerns that jitterbuggers and massive swing concerts, there was racial mixing, and there was concerns, especially that the emotional power of the music would drive blind people's reason, and that it appeared a kind of fascism. It seemed like some sort of American version of European mass, the spectacle of fascism. And there was a debate about this, and it got very heated. And in the 50s, so the debate in the 30s was really about like, what do we do about this? Like, we need to win the war. We need to get everyone on board. We can't have racial divisions. I'm speaking as if I'm, in the Roosevelt administration or something like, what do we do with this energy, right? And this racial energy, because it seems to be destabilizing, raising issues of race and gender and all these things, and we need to fight this war, right? The post-war period, what seemed to me happen is that there was still that strong association with jazz in this kind of racialized way of being and feeling, and that it kind of tapped into something like that. But then the key was to kind of contain it. And I use that metaphor of containment as I borrow that from many American studies scholars, but it made perfect sense. So like in the film Blackboard Jungle, which I don't know, I mean, I could talk about this for hours. Once you watch it, I have a few movies like this, Dirty Dancing, but that's a whole other book project. But Blackboard Jungle is totally fascinating because you can read it in lots of ways. And the jazz is actually, like most people know it as that's the moment where rock and roll, the sort of rock around the clock, which is the kind of white version of R&B, kind of breaks through into the mainstream. But the Rick, who's the teacher, and his buddy, or I forget his name now. Rick, who's the teacher who goes to this rough school with these juvenile delinquents who listen to rock and roll, and Josh, his friend is Josh, and they're two teachers, and Josh is a huge jazz fan and makes jazz references throughout the film. And there's a very famous scene where he brings in his jazz records, and the delinquents kind of mock him, and they grab the records and they smash it, and it's Josh is just this broken man, right? Teaching these kids math, and it's a hilarious thing where he's like, music's all about math, and anyways. What was interesting is that the way the film puts rock and roll against jazz, and it's interesting because all those associations of jazz from New Orleans and the red light district and deviancy and drug use, and I mean that was all circulating, and this is the era. Heroin's kind of ripping through the jazz community, and I mean it's a real thing, but the way the film positions jazz, it becomes the other to rock and roll. So it becomes a music of a lot of the jazz artists it's complicated because a lot of the music that's referenced are by white musicians, but still it's almost like that affect that people were so fearful of in the 30s is kind of domesticated and contained. And there's a logic here too, because Rick and Josh were the swing era teenagers. Now they're grown up. They've been through the war. And like that energy, that racialized energy has been kind of contained. You could argue kind of, the danger kind of removed or it's deracinated or deracialized in some sense as well. So that's kind of how I framed things in the 50s, that the affect and the debates around it and the racialized affect kind of gets kind of contained. And so people aren't really hating jazz in the same way. Like things change. Like the argument, in the 50s, it was, I don't hate jazz. I just don't like this kind of jazz or this, you know what I mean? So that's kind of how I framed it. But I think John can speak about what was actually happening.
And I will briefly, looking at the clock, but yeah, I mean, Music Inn was one of the places where questions about where jazz fits into the cultural field was really being played out in a really interesting way. Because of the proximity to Tanglewood, this whole operation is part of the, kind of legitimizing narrative for jazz. This is serious music. It's being taken seriously by the people at Tanglewood, both the musicians and the audiences, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, it's programming, folk music, um, and incidentally, the politics, literally the politics, capital P politics, are really important. Um, the place was a kind of refuge for folk musicians who were blacklisted. The very first concert at Music Inn is Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Alan Lomax, Reverend Gary Davis. I may be forgetting one. Gus will know. Um, this happens 3 weeks after they were named in the Red Scare, kind of newsletter that became the blueprint for the blacklist. Um, Philip Barber, the co-proprietor of the place, had been a man of the theater, and he, in fact, he had been the New York director of the New York chapter of the Federal Theater Project in the 30s, until and focused it mainly on Harlem and programmed mainly really left-leaning material. This caught the attention of the newly formed House Un-American Activities Committee, which thinks that this kind of racial inclusivity ethos is communist, literally, and they cut off the funding. So those politics are in the air in the early 50s. By 1956, and Marshall Stearns loses his teaching job at Indiana University because he started an NAACP chapter, and he's a rabble-rouser. By 56, in no small part because of what Music Inn has done to kind of kind of separate the music from bohemian and political, kind of radical subcultures. Now it's being used by the State Department in the foreign jazz tours, and Stearns becomes a propagandist for this music of democracy. Rock and roll is the other, to be sure, and it's it's fascinating. Like the holes from a retrospective position in the curriculum at the School of Jazz and in the programming was quote unquote popular music. You had the Kingston Trio, and there was actually a kind of riot at Lenox before there was one at Newport. But they're not, they're the closest they get to what we would now consider, rhythm and blues and early rock and roll would have been John Lee Hooker, who was there as a participant in a roundtable discussion and not as a featured performer. And then the school has a curriculum that the so-called third stream, the kind of bringing together of classical and jazz under the auspices of Gunther Schuller, who teaches at the school, and one of the famous students at the school is Ornette Coleman, who's playing on recordings with Schuller and John Lewis, before his quartet, blows up the world with free jazz. The thing that's missing is what we later called soul jazz. What was popular in black neighborhoods at that time. And even though Music Inn was enormously influential in, creating the concept of jazz education and in having a place, the artistic director of the school was John Lewis. The faculty was mostly black musicians. So black musicians are the authority figures at this place, et cetera, et cetera. Still, it's cutting out in so many ways the whole kind of the popular, if you will, and that's, I think, continued down to our time to be the kind of bugbear of where we position jazz in the cultural field, how we organize conferences, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's it's such a complex moment, and the discourse that you both describe is, I think, really enlightening in understanding the complexity of that moment. Um, Eric, I don't know where we are in terms of ready to hit some questions or
Yeah, totally fine too.
okay.
Um, for some reason, I'm not able to see myself on the Zoom, but I'm coming through okay. You can hear me, Ben? Okay,
Yes.
great. Um, I'll throw in just as the parallel movie reference to Blackboard Jungle, Jailhouse Rock, where the Elvis character is taken to a party of university types in some middle of the suburbs kind of community, and they're at the party talking to the each other about Dave Brubeck and modern jazz, and then they say, "Well, to the Elvis character, you're a musician. What do you think?" And Elvis's character says, "Mister, I don't know what the hell you're talking about," and storms out. So we definitely have plenty of things that we can talk about. We have many questions on aspects of jazz hating through the ages, and I suspect there's some effort to periodize the hatred. Alex, you want to get us going?
Oh, sure. First off, great conversation. I'm interested in reading both of these books. Yeah, I had made an observation about Sex and the City, how there's like an episode of Sex and the City where Carrie Bradshaw is dating a jazz guy, and she admits that I don't like jazz because she can't follow it. Which gets into sort of gendered aspects of reception, and I think also like anti-fandom in the form of like disliking a genre because of your perception of who the target audience is. So I was wondering if you could speak a little to, I guess like a form of anti-fandom, I guess two forms of anti-fandom, the sort of collapse of the ideal listener, along with maybe some issues of accessibility with being able to grasp the genre.
Yes, excellent question. I deal mostly with gender in the chapter where I'm dealing with within the jazz community, and I talk about misogyny and sexism and kind of differentiate the two, and then talk about women in jazz and their and queer jazz musicians as well. And I don't actually address kind of exactly what you're talking about, like the gendered aspects of taste. But it's super interesting because in a lot of the examples, there's an example that I found Saturday Evening Post article from the 50s. And it was important to me to look for things where they use the word hate, because that seemed to be key. And there was this story, mid 50s, not by anyone very well known, but it was called The Lady Hated Jazz. And it was a short story, and it's great. And but man, the Saturday Evening Post, they charged me a fortune to reprint the image. But so the lady hated jazz. So it turns out she doesn't hate jazz. She just had a bad experience with a roommate in college who dated a musician, and that musician did something terrible, right? So she actually doesn't hate the music. And then the whole she's fallen for this guy who runs a hardware store, used to be a jazz trumpeter. And the final scene is he serenades her with a song, like a Gershwin song or something. So it's interesting. It's not something I really addressed. But wait a minute, so there are other parts to your question. There was the gendered hate as gendered.
And also just maybe like the sort of issues of accessibility of being able to approach the music itself. A way
Yes.
in.
Yeah. That's excellent. Two things. One, when I was, so I'm telling a kind of historical survey, but of course I go and you just search the internet just for what people say, and Reddit boards and things like that are great. And, the standard criticisms are interesting, and they're perhaps not so surprising. So people say the music is, I didn't say this before, but, I was operating not with any kind of normative definition of jazz. I was its indeterminacy, that it kind of meant different things at different times, different groups of people. That's kind of important to the story. But what's interesting is that looking today, so jazz means a lot of things today, and I deal with this in some of the humorous and satirical attacks. Because what people are making fun of kind of really differs depending on the comedian and what their target is and such. But the Reddit boards are interesting as a just kind of general snapshot. So it's formless. jazz has no melody, or jazz has too much melody, or jazz is too hard to follow. Or jazz, the other critiques are the rhythm is too chaotic. So there's a lot of emphasis on lack of form, lack of melody, and inability to follow what's going on, right? But what's always interesting here is that it always shades into a kind of value judgment. And that value judgment is, and a lot of it gets framed in think pieces and such that this music has this great cultural value, right? This importance. It's like, the vegetable of popular music. You're supposed to like it and it's supposed to improve you. It's a borrowed discourse that has, its own historical story. And so when people say, I don't like it, it doesn't have form, I can't follow it, it's almost like it's an attack on you because you're too stupid, or you don't understand, or this or that. I think it also has a racial component as well, and it kind of reads differently, that critique across. It was interesting in the humorous attacks. They tend to focus on these different things, but different people would focus on. There's a Fred Armisen clip out there that's easy to watch where he's like, you all say you like jazz, but I'm going to play you some jazz. And I'm not sure what he plays, but it's free-ish jazz, maybe on the avant-garde. It's not clear. Right. It's not a bebop tune with a single soloist and a driving swing rhythm, that kind of thing. And so I think I got most of what I wanted to say to you about that. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you.
Cool. Antonia, I wanted to bring you in. You were sort of talking about contexts in the Black community where you're almost not allowed to hate jazz. And I thought that was something that we should take out of only the comments and bring into the discussion and see if both of our speakers might want to talk to that. So you want to kind of make the case there?
Sure. No, I was thinking that coming from a hip hop fandom point of view, so much of golden age rap was sampling jazz music, and it's because folks grew up with jazz in their background, even if they didn't listen to it themselves. And I think beyond that, oh, sorry, my mindfulness bell, it would be hard pressed as a African American person, I think, to be completely dismissive of jazz because it does seem like it's the one kind of music that has gotten reverence within the dominant culture. So as a African American person, I don't think we're at liberty to think that to say that we hate jazz. We can say that it's boring. We can say that it's old fashioned. But I don't think, probably similarly with blues, it'd be hard to position yourself as a Black person saying that I hate jazz.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the argument in Mo Better Blues about this, about what kind of music should be played and enjoyed within the community.
Well, let me see what I can say here. I have a very close friend from college who is a prominent Black intellectual academic. I am sworn never to tell anybody that he hates jazz. And what I mean, one time I come back to the room and he's playing, I don't know what it was. It was awful. I said, "What's up with this?" And he said, "Well, it's not as bad as that Coltrane record that you were playing the other day." It's almost like it's one of those, kind of racial uplift, kind of responsibilities, if you will. And there's so many ways to connect with jazz that are rebuffed, I think, because of the ways that a certain kind of elitism has attached itself to the music, and when you get hip hop musicians, sampling, um, from jazz recordings, well, what's going to happen is, like the jazz purists are going to say, well, that's not really a jazz recording anyway. So there's all that kind of, you know, ideology, really, taste and ideology sort of, circling through all of that. But the, the place and the moment that I'm focused on in this book, another reason it was important is because there were a lot of African American um, participants who were not musicians, who became writers and artists and such. And in the same way that the Newport Jazz Festival became a place where African American middle class summer vacationers would go. That was true to a certain extent of with Lennox as well. So the social history of the who's showing up for these things and how that connects with um, folks in the African American community is important.
If I could just speak just briefly to that, when I talk about humor, uh, of the kind of two things that kind of I discovered that were sort of new that surprised me as I was writing the book was I was looking for people making fun of jazz, and I every single example was from white comedians across the board. I could not find a single example, and I thought it would be interesting, right? Because the stakes are different, as Antonia as points out, and that would be a book in and of itself. But the stakes are clearly different, and what was interesting about that was not only that there were no black very like prominent examples of people, black comedians in particular, or writers or things like that, making fun of jazz. But what became interesting is that the target of from these white comedians, like who the target was a kind of shifting sort of thing, and it became fun to kind of trace out who the real target was, and that's where things get interesting because so I do talk about this kind of notorious piece by this comedian Django Gold in the New Yorker, where he writes a fake oral history of Sonny Rollins. And it's a while ago, it's 2014, but it really incensed jazz critics, and it didn't really bother me. I think maybe it was not the funniest thing I've ever read, but what was interesting is it wasn't clear who the target was. And I think this is the case with a lot of the jazz humor I write about. Is it there's always this uncomfortable sense that it might be targeted at Black culture, at Black people, but it's not. Humor is your kind of exit way, right? So maybe the target is the jazz bros, Nate Chinnon's great phrase of like the conservatory jazz, boys, and they're, I guess I was one of those in a way, and their, elitism and snobbery. And so there's this, the humor is interesting that it's coming from white people, but it always seems to have this uncomfortable, like, is this about race really? Is this an attack on Black culture? I don't know. So I just wanted to say that. Sorry, I don't want to take too much time.
No, it's all great. I'm going to switch the order a little just to switch the subject for a second. David, do you want to come in and ask about the Music Inn's legacy a little more?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. John, I read the book a few weeks ago. I thought it was great, and I learned a lot from it, and I think it really establishes in this interesting way the place of the Music in and but I wanted to bring this back to place, which is so important in the project, and ask if you could talk about how the Berkshires the is changed by the Jazz Inn and the School of Jazz. I mean, it's clear that, or you establish in the book quite effectively, the Jazz's changed by it, that it has an impact. But I was wondering, particularly in terms of this ecosystem with the other cultural institutions in that area, is there a legacy, or are there legacies, plural, of the jazz inn?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, thank you, David. That kind of legitimacy issue, and the music in proximity to physical proximity and proximity of or sharing of personnel between Tanglewood and Music Inn, was such an important part of the discourse as a way to kind of uplift jazz. But it doesn't take Tanglewood long to figure out that I'm talking now about starting in the late '60s into the 70s, that their traditional audience, the audience for classical music, that's not a very good business proposition for a place that is programming a whole summer's worth of material, has all kinds of fixed costs, property maintenance, taxes, et cetera, et cetera. It's a place that, it has a shed that can seat about 5,000 and grounds that can fit another 10 to 12,000. So they start programming both jazz and rock music and pop, et cetera. The person who's now sort of synonymous with Tanglewood is James Taylor, who lives in Lenox now. But I spent 2 hours on the phone yesterday with this woman from Berkshire Magazine who wants to do a feature on the centennial of Miles Davis, with a focus on the concert that he gave in 1970 at Tanglewood. He opened for Santana. Miles oftentimes opened for people, which seemed to, be a strange, configuration, but he just preferred to do it that way. Really important concert because it's one of the very first ones that comes after the release of Bitches Brew, and that's the music that he's playing. It's the band with Keith Jarrett and Chick Corea and Jack DeJohnette and Dave Holland and Airto. And if you Google this, there's a really excellent video of the particularly the Miles performance, and it's really kind of stunning. I mean, this is the place where Tanglewood. This is the space where Leonard Bernstein. One of the spaces where Leonard Bernstein becomes famous. It's the Kusevitsky legacy and the New Music Festival that brings in kind of avant-garde, contemporary avant-garde, quote unquote, classical music. But it is Tanglewood down to our own time is programming quite a bit of jazz, rock, pop. Wynton Marsalis goes to Tanglewood as a classical music student, comes back and performs both classical music and jazz. So there's that. There's a kind of scrambling of the hierarchy, as it were. There's a lot of jazz in the Berkshires that grows right out of Music Inn because a lot of the musicians end up buying property in the area or living full time in the area. Ahmad Jamal, for a time, is living in the Berkshires. Jimmy Giuffre lived close by. George Russell, very close with Jimmy, spent a lot of time out there, and others. George Schuler, Gunther Schuler's son, he's based in Brooklyn, but spends a lot of time up in the Berkshires, doing jazz gigs. There's only in the last couple of years, and this has nothing to do with my book, but it's been a good, kind of moment for my book. that it's only the last couple of years that the kind of jazz in the Berkshires organizing effort has really gotten it together. And there have been some festivals, small festivals now and then. There's going to be a Williamstown Jazz Festival in the fall, but they're approaching this in not as a kind of nostalgia for the 1950s, but a recognition that the Berkshires, once again should be a place that should be at the center of the cutting edge of jazz. And so there's going to be some interesting programming coming down just in the near future.
Thanks. One last question for today, and let's take it back to jazz hating one last time so we can go out with a bang. Brian.
Hello. Thanks so much it's great to hear about both of these books. I'll admit I've spent more time on the Andy's book than John's, but I'm looking forward to programming them for my upcoming seminar in the fall. My question about jazz hate was actually about the internal. I'm much more interested in the infighting of jazz than the people who, don't care about jazz and hate it anyway. And you talk about in the book this idea of like real feelings versus performed feelings, that there's this sense of like it's performative, the hating of other subgenres of jazz by other jazz musicians. And I was wondering if you could talk about that performativity aspect and how do you parse out like the virtue signaling performativity aspect from the sincere, whatever you want to call it, aesthetic, real feelings aspect?
Thanks, Brian. Honestly, I don't think I can. I mean, in the case of some of Miles Davis's really vituperative comments over the years and the blindfold test and such, it was more from kind of context. That he was a provocateur, and you can tell like it's just a few years between them, and his opinions have changed really dramatically. And his opinions probably did change, but he was also, I think we know that he was going to be determining the bounds of his reception. He was going to control that, and so I think there was a bit of I think some of it was provocative. The provocateur. I think Stanley Crouch too is a provocateur as well. Not that he didn't deeply hold these things, but I think in the real extravagance of his prose, his attacks on Miles Davis, which I wanted to write about these articles he did on Miles Davis. Stanley Crouch did he wrote them in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't know. I mean, he's a brilliant writer. He's a kind of brilliant thinker, but you completely disagree with everything. And his comments on Davis, like the only part of Davis's career he really likes is this like small window, like after Charlie Parker and before the first great quintet, and it's just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think there is a bit of the provocateur to some of the jazz hating in internal. So Wynton Marsalis, Bradford Marsalis, like I cite this other thing where some interview in an Australian newspaper and people are like, Branford Marsalis, why do people not like jazz? And he's like, the musicians suck. And so, and I think when you're saying something like that in a public forum, I think there is an element of the performative as well. But that being said, I don't think I can really parse what's real and what's not. I really have to go by what they say.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew Berish, John Gennari, Benjamin Cawthra. Terrific discussion. We'll send you all the comments, which went in a million other directions too. 2 weeks from now, we're back with a couple of books about club music. But that's it for tonight from PIMBIP. So thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, John.
Thank you, guys. That was great.
John, we should talk. I'm from, I grew up on the East Coast of Massachusetts. The south of Boston. So
Right.
I have a